Okay, so we are getting ready to hem stitch. I have this little kind of needle minder. It's magnetic, and it magnets to something that is a screw or something on the underside of the loom. So it stays on that little shelf and collects all sorts of things. So I have threaded a needle with the weft that's attached to the weaving. And I'm going to advance the warp just a little bit more so it's just more comfortable for me. So I can't weave this, but I can use it for hem stitching. I'm just going to give it one more little beat to set it into place. And I've chosen to use my blue weft, which is a contrast color in this pattern. One, because it's easier to see, but two, because as I mentioned in the last live, it's just going to be easier for me to work with. It's not going to twist on itself as much. And the hem stitching action, you're not going to be able to see so much in this video, but I do have other videos both on Instagram and on YouTube showing how it's done. It just secures the weft into place, and it's going to protect the weft from unraveling while the warp, or while the fabric is being washed, is the main reason for doing it. And if you have an overlocker or a sewing machine that has a zigzag function, you can absolutely do those to secure the warp and the weft. I'm choosing not to do that on this project because I'm pretty sure that I started with hem stitching, so if I started with it, I want to end with it. It is a nicer finish and it wastes a little bit less fabric. So that is the main reason for doing it. And the reason that I'm doing it on the loom before I cut off the loom is because it's going to be a lot easier. Once it's cut off the loom, you lose all that tension, just of the warp being held into place and everything just all nice and tidy, and it becomes fabric. Once you take it off the loom, it becomes kind of unwieldy, and to do the hem stitching on that is something I would not want to try. I think I have tried it before. I don't remember in what context, but it's not fun. It's really not fun. Because this is not a scarf or a table runner or some other thing that is going to have the hem stitching on display as part of the final product, I'm not being too obsessively precise about it. But I do want to keep in mind that the size of my stitches, the size of the groupings that of warp yarns that I'm catching, I don't want them to be too big. If they're too big, they'll kind of flop off in the wash, and then that sort of defeats the purpose of the hem stitching. When this is done, I will throw it in the washing machine, so it is going to be sturdy enough to put up with that. And only once have I had one or two of the hem stitches fall off, but the whole weft hasn't started to unravel from that. The hem stitching will be enough. I'm going to put it in the washing machine, probably on cold water because that's how I'm going to wash the garment. The washing machine that I have right now is, it does not have a center agitator. I don't love it. I actually really hate my washing machine. But it's going to go in the washing machine. The first time that I wash it, I'm not going to use the spin cycle. There's some thought behind this that the spin cycle can set creases in your fabric, and it's only the first time that it gets washed. So what I'll do is I won't use the spin cycle. I'll hang it to dry. I'll kind of pull out any creases that might be there. I will hang it to dry, probably outside in the sun because it's going to be dripping wet. And then I will tumble dry it in the dryer on high heat. It's probably the only time that it's going to go in the dryer, is that first time. When I sew it into a garment, I hang dry all of my hand sewn garments just to make them last longer. But that first time I want it to get the roughest treatment it possibly can. So it's going to go through the washing machine once with no spin cycle, hang to dry or drip dry until it's just damp. It's going to go in the dryer. The dryer, that heat from the dryer really puffs up some of that, those threads. And then it's probably best to run it through the washing machine one more time, and this time use the spin cycle and then pop it right into the dryer. Does that sound complicated enough? But the real frustration is when you've spent all this time making the fabric and it comes out of the washing machine with permanent creases in it. It's just absolute pain in the butt. We just had a lot of rain. We were lucky that we were not in the direct path of Tropical Storm Debbie, but we've gotten about 10 inches of rain in the last 3 days, and we're on a septic system. So probably not going to be washing this twice in a row for the next few days. Give some time for all that water to percolate. But it's worth it to end up with something that's wearable and doesn't have wrinkles that you're always frustrated with. Okay. The hem stitching is a little bit time consuming, not gonna lie. When I'm working on that loom and I've got something that's 40 inches wide, I'm like, why am I doing this? But it's a really nice finish. I think you asked a question too about knots. Expecting much shrinkage. I'll answer the question about knots and then I'll get to shrinkage. I'm not going to tie any knots. You could tie knots in place of the hem stitching, and I have done that. But the longer your fringe is, the more it gets kind of like shaggy and nasty in the washing machine, and it kind of like felts together on itself. It's just gross, and it puts more stress on your washing machine because you have more lint going out into that system, and it puts more stress on your dryer, and it's just, I try to avoid that if I can. You're trading one convenience for another. So I avoid tying those knots and leaving the loose fringe if I can. The hem stitching lets me cut it to be about 1 inch to 1/2 inch long. And that really, there's not much play, not nearly as much play with that, those ends faulting together. With shrinkage, every yarn is different, every weave structure is different. This is plain weave and it's cotton. I would expect 10 to 20% shrinkage, both in length and width. So and the weird thing is that right now, when this is on the loom, it has been stretched to as far as this yarn wants to stretch without breaking. It's at its limit. I don't know if you've ever seen those videos where people cut into a cone of yarn and it just all sort of explodes like a pom-pom. It's under a lot of tension just like that. So after I take it off the loom, it's going to shrink back down into the state that it wants to be in, lengthwise. So you're going to have some shrinkage there. And there are workshops where people will be weaving something under incredibly high tension. Usually it's like rugs or something on a really big, really strong loom. And they literally take them off the loom and they put them down on the floor, and everybody will watch it shrink down. Like, you can see it before your very eyes. This is probably not going to be quite that dramatic, but it will shrink some at that stage. And then when I wash it, it will shrink. I'm guessing 10 to 20%. I'll take a note of it when I take it off the loom and then again when I get it out of the washing machine and the dryer. So you pretty much always are accounting for shrinkage in your weaving. And this is where sampling becomes really important. So ideally, if you have enough yarn and enough time, you would add half a yard, or whatever, to the length of your warp. You'd weave a little bit, you'd cut it off, you'd wash it and dry it, however you're planning to wash and dry the final piece. And then you would record the measurements before it was washed and the measurements afterwards. With this piece, I chose to make a guess and then add 2 extra yards. And this guess is based on how much I've experienced cotton shrinking in the past and how much more fabric I wished I'd had in the past. And if I end up with too much, then I'll just make other things out of it. Scrunchies and book covers and things like that. Okay, so my last stitch in hem stitching, and I'm going to just needle weave that tail back a couple of stitches and then break the yarn. And now we're ready to cut off the loom, which is the fun part. If you were planning to tie on a new piece onto this loom, you would want to make sure to cut in front. And you would want to tie your warp into knots as you're cutting it off so it doesn't fly off the back beam. I don't particularly like to do that because especially on this loom, it's not a very complex pattern, so it's not going to be that much effort to do another one, to set up the loom again. I'm rarely setting up the same exact pattern twice, so I'm not concerned about that. So you're going to see things kind of popping off the back beam here probably, because remember, we are under all that tension. Okay, so that is my loom waist, which is just under a foot, it looks like. So that's pretty good. And that's one of the things that I really like about this loom, is that it really offers a lot of bang for your buck. All right, and here is my fabric. So it's got that turquoise check to it. And I'm really interested to see what that does in the wash. Right now it has this consistency of almost like cheesecloth or canvas. It's kind of stiff. I'm not too worried about that because I know how this fabric feels after it's been washed. And there's a lot of oils and things that were part of the spinning process in it. Okay, so I've got all this yardage there. Oh, thank you. Okay, and then I need to take it off the front beam as well, and that's another cut. Okay. When you are cutting off, you want to be careful not to cut the cords on your loom. This is something I've learned from experience. So the cords on your loom are holding everything together, and they're holding everything at a really consistent distance. And when you cut one of those cords, you have to redo all of those things, and it's so hard to get everything back precisely where you thought it was. It's just not very much fun. Okay, so how much loom waist did I have at the start? Great question. So I weave a header. So the way that I tie on, I'm just gonna untie it so we can kind of take a look at it. The way that I tie on is with a lark's head knot that's then secured with another knot. So kind of a square knot, but not quite. And then I weave a header, which is just some waste yarn, which I'm fighting my way through to pull that out. And what the header does is it evens everything out, it spaces everything out so that you're weaving, if you don't have it spaced out, you'll have these big gaps. They're kind of awkward. So the header fixes that. Some people put all sorts of wild things into their header. Some people use toilet paper or plastic bags. I just find a shuttle that's got yarn on it that I'm not using, and then I use that for my header. So that looks like another foot. So 2 feet, and I will use this yarn for other things. Obviously, there's not a whole lot of it in this one bundle, but across the warp and with weaving a new warp every month or so, it really builds up. So I will separate these by color or weight or whatever fiber they are. Right now I'm weaving mostly in cotton, so I'm not having to separate things out by fiber. But I'll sort of put them into piles and deal with them later. If there are any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Thank you so much for all of your questions. If you wanted to see how it gets tied on and the header process, I'm pretty sure I have that video on YouTube. So you can definitely check on YouTube for that. Thanks so much for joining. I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.